Hello, and welcome to the American Civil War in 15 minutes. As the title suggests, I am going to summarize and cut a lot of things, so apologies in advance for people who feel like I've skipped things. Spoiler alert, I'm going to. So, the American Civil War is kicked off as a result of the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln is swept into office with a majority of the electoral votes, though it should be noted, because there were four total candidates for president that year, Lincoln only received around 40% of the popular vote. Almost immediately after his election, the majority of the states, which are going to be the states in rebellion, secede. Those are indicated on the left. The last four states who secede, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, all do so only after the battle at Fort Sumner, even though it's not much of a battle. The question that we have to ask ourselves at the outset of the American Civil War is it a foregone conclusion? The North has a variety of different massive advantages over the rebellious Southern states. First of all, there's a huge population advantage here for the North and the American government. It has well over double the amount of population that the states in the South in rebellion possess. It has huge industrial advantages. In fact, there was not one rifle works, not one factory capable of producing firearms in the entire South in 1860. It also had a navy and had all the major financial institutions. The plan that the North is going to adopt to try to take advantage of all of its advantages is what's called the Anaconda Plan. In the Anaconda Plan, there's basically three parts. Number one, just blockade the South from sea. The reality is that the South needs to import most of the goods it's going to need to fight the war. If the American government can effectively blockade the Southern rebellious states, then it can squeeze the life out of them, much like a large snake, the anaconda. Number two, control the Mississippi. If you look at a map of the United States and you look at the states which secede, you'll notice that a couple of them are to the west of the Mississippi. The American government realized early on that if it could control the Mississippi, it would be able to take those states effectively off the board and make cooperation impossible. Hence, they're fighting a lot less. Once this is done, they could slowly crush the rebellion by land and sea, bringing their enormous other advantages to bear. Now, I'm going to walk through the principal battles of the American Civil War and sort of explain how they lead to the outcome which happens in 1865. That being said, the simple reality that the Southern rebellious states were able to keep their independence for over 4 years is frankly a testament to some of the skill and capacity of not only the Southern soldiers, but the generals which they had. The first battle that sort of convinces everyone that this is not going to be a quick battle and quick war is going to be the Battle of Bull Run, otherwise known as the Battle of Manassas. This takes place in Manassas Gap in Virginia, just to the southwest of Washington, D.C. While the battle technically was a draw, from an overall strategic position, most historians count it as a Southern victory because it blocks what would have been an immediate attempt to take the Confederacy off the board. The second battle that's worth noting is the Battle of Shiloh, which takes place almost a year later. So it takes a while for some of the major conflicts in the American Civil War to heat up. The Battle of Shiloh is extremely important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is another draw or Union victory, depending upon how you choose to look at it. The battle was fought in Shiloh, Tennessee, and was the first major battle that soon to be Union commander and soon to be president Ulysses S. Grant will take part in. The other reason that the Battle of Shiloh is important is because it results in massive casualties on both sides, none the least of which the death of General Johnston, who was one of the most important Southern generals at the time. His death creates sort of this manpower shortage at the top that we will see plague the Southern states as the war progresses. Now, speaking of that Anaconda Plan, New Orleans falls to the United States government on April the 25th, 1862, effectively taking away the most important southern port and the most profitable port by far. From there, the American forces were able to slowly work their way up the Mississippi, severing the western states from the eastern ones. After this, we have what's called the Peninsula Campaign. So early on in the war, this is the first time that Southern General Robert E. Lee begins to see a lot of action. And he does a very good job of checking the advance of Union General George McClellan. George McClellan's problem throughout the war is that he loves his army. In fact, he loves his army so much that he does not want to risk any major casualties. So even though he enjoys a massive manpower advantage over Robert E. Lee and the Southern rebellious armies, he's unable to bring those, or I should say rather, unwilling to bring those numbers to bear. The Peninsula Campaign is seen as one of Robert E. Lee's first great tactical military successes. After the Peninsula Campaign, Lee divides his army and chooses to march north into states that have remained loyal to the United States of America in an effort to try to force the United States to defend on its own territory and thereby put enough pressure on the United States government to sign a peace treaty. He's early on able to recognize that there's really only two ways this ends for the Southern rebellious states. Either they're able to score a major military victory, putting pressure on the United States government to strike a deal, or two, foreign intervention. Just like France helped the American colonists during the Revolutionary War, the hope is that France or Great Britain will intervene in the American Civil War, which of course they will not. The Battle of Antietam is effectively a draw. This is another Robert E. Lee versus George McClellan contest, where once again, McClellan's tentative strategy allows Lee to continue to operate successfully, even though he doesn't have a large portion of his army. Still, a draw is better than a loss. And after the draw, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he declares all persons currently enslaved in states that are in rebellion to be free. This transforms the war from a war to preserve the Union, from some people's perspective, to a war to end slavery. I should note, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free individuals enslaved in current border states that were still loyal to the Union, notably Maryland and Kentucky. The Emancipation Proclamation is followed by the two most important and most critical victories by Robert E. Lee and the Southern Confederate States. The Battle of Fredericksburg, which takes place in Virginia just before Christmas 1862, saw a Union army throw a wave of Union soldiers up against a fortified Confederate position. The result, massive casualties for the American government and a massive win for the Southern states. This was followed by what is usually seen as the high water mark for the Southern states. The Battle of Chancellorsville was definitely Robert E. Lee's greatest tactical achievement. Though he was already outnumbered, General Lee decided to divide his army, sending a unit under then General Stonewall Jackson on a long march around the Union Army. They appeared on an undefended flank and were able to surprise the American troops, pushing them back towards the Rappahannock River. Had Lee been successful in forcing the complete surrender of who is Joe Hooker, General Joe Hooker's Union Army, the war may have ended very differently with a Confederate victory. He's unable to force that final surrender. The Union Army escapes, and that is going to be the beginning of the end for the Southern states. Two major victories in July of 1863 bring this full circle. Between May and the 4th of July, 1863, General Grant leads American forces in the West to victory at Vicksburg, a major city on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg's fall precipitates the complete collapse of the Mississippi. Union forces now control the Mississippi River, allowing them to execute Part 2 of their Anaconda Plan. The victory at Vicksburg happens the same day that Robert E. Lee's Southern forces are decisively defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg. Never again after this will Lee have the ability to put any sort of offensive pressure on the American government. From this point on, it's dig in and hope someone comes to the rescue. By July of 1864, things are falling apart for the southern states. In July 22nd of that year, General Sherman sweeps in from Tennessee and takes the city of Atlanta, taking away one of the most crucial industrial centers from the Confederacy's control. This is followed by what's known as Sherman's March to the Sea. General Sherman, leading tens of thousands of American soldiers, takes a brutal and devastating march through what is today southern Georgia and then through South Carolina all the way to Charleston, destroying plantations as he goes and almost by himself crushing Southern will to fight. By April of 1865, the war has almost come to a conclusion. Confederate forces had been forced to essentially turn Petersburg, which is actually to the southeast of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, into what looks like a World War I style battlefield with trenches and fortifications. These trenches and fortifications, for a time, do allow the Southern forces to make up for the fact that they're outnumbered by massive amounts. But at this point, Robert E. Lee is no longer facing a general who's afraid to match him. He is now facing General Ulysses S. Grant, who is more than willing to use the army that he's been given. On April the 2nd, 1865, Confederate forces are overwhelmed at Petersburg, and as a result, the capital city of Richmond falls into American hands. This is followed barely a week later by Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse signals the end of the American Civil War. Now, in the end, we do have to ask ourselves again, was the result inevitable given the advantages that the Union forces possessed? Many scholars would argue that yes, so long as the American government was willing to pay the price in terms of men and materials, and so long as the American public was willing to absorb that cost, the Southern rebellious states simply did not have a chance. This is, of course, all with the caveat that had foreign governments intervened in the war, the outcome may have been very differently. So there you have it, the American Civil War in less than 15 minutes.